All right, everybody, welcome back to the Protocol Town Hall, a periodic guest talk series focused on protocols and protocol research. In today's Researcher Salon, we'll be speaking with Kia Kreutler about her Summer Protocols project titled Artificial Memory and Orienting Infinity. There will be a link to the forum.summerprotocols.com in the chat that will bring you to the forum for Summer Protocols, in which we'll host any conversation, questions, comments during this researcher salon. And you can check out lots of other information at forum.summerprotocols.com. Our next town hall will be a guest talk on Wednesday, March 6th with TV writer producer Steve Healy. You can find out more about the Summer Protocols research, protocol Git, and guest talk calendar at summerofprotocols.com. So I'll go ahead and hand it off to Venkat to introduce our speaker today.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Really excited to hear Kia's talk today. Throughout the summer program, memory turned out to be one of the most interesting, I think, interconnection themes between the projects, because I think we all discovered through our conversations that one of the things that distinguishes protocols from things like standards and other similar looking things is that protocols kind of develop a memory, and you can apply the memory lens on protocols to institutions as well. And we've had many interesting discussions on that. And from a personal angle, I found Kia's research really interesting because my own interest in time is almost like the flip side of the coin. So time and memory work really well together as a dual lens for looking at a whole variety of topics. So yeah, over to you, Kia, and let's talk memory.
Cool, thanks so much. I'll share my screen. Second. Okay, can you see the presentation? Great.
Yes.
Great, so my talk today is called Artificial Memory and Orienting Infinity. It will be something of an experiment and an attention span because I'm going very closely with the essay that I wrote for the program. So as Venkat mentioned, I explored the topic of memory throughout the Summer Protocols session last year. And at first it was kind of a question of how the role that memory plays in protocols, and it slowly transformed into the role that protocols play in memory. And I wanted to look at how protocols play a role for memory in kind of the advent of computing. But first I had to go back about 2,000 years. And so a lot of my research is kind of pinned on this diagram, which I won't explain too much, but just let it be there for anyone who wants to go back. And exploring the really standard retellings of, in a Western context, a history of memory, that there's certain lineages that think of memory as a bunch of different metaphors, but that within these different metaphors, there's essentially kind of two strains of thought that I noticed that are kind of meeting back up together now through the combination of associative logic and taxonomic logic that we see through computation. So by the end of the talk, hopefully all these statements will be a little bit more clear. But I started getting really interested in essentially how we so easily equate data with memory and memory with data, and trying to trace back that question. Produce this. So first, the topic of artificial memory. So basically like 400 years before the term artificial intelligence existed, many people debated the merits of artificial memory. So this is a kind of protocolized procedural approach to memorization. So here, Cornelius Agrippa, who is like a theologian, physician, mathematician, one of those Renaissance figures, is writing in 1530 saying, artificial memory would not be able to last for the briefest second without natural memory. Artificial memory, by overburdening the natural memory with innumerable images of words and things, can lead those who are not content with the limits imposed upon them by nature to the point of madness. So here we have Agrippa, and he's just like surrounded by these images of innumerable worlds and things, and just it's only getting worse for him, essentially. And when we get to kind of a contemporary context too, we have philosophers like Bernard Stiegler saying that the construction of every tool, not just the existence of every image, also constructs a memory support. He writes, when a prehistoric man cuts flint, obviously he doesn't cut flint to preserve his memory, but the act of cutting preserves his gestures on the flint, and in fact constitutes a new memory support. So here we have not only the idea that technology or artificial memory surrounds us with like innumerable images of words and things, and we have Agrippa like really sad, like crying now. It's also like every technology also acts as a form of memory. But however, like through this lens with like every piece of technology or every complex system representing a form of memory, and with memory and technologies so closely woven together like this, with kind of each the shadow side of the other, popular understandings of memory can reveal new understandings of technology, especially when we look at the contemporary definition of memory today. So this is the Oxford definition of memory. So it's the psychological function of preserving information, involving the processes of encoding, storage, and retrieval. And it's funny with this definition because it could be nearly applicable to both human brains and computers, except for the psychological function part. And there's this kind of like unnatural, let's say, artificial quality of this definition already. And it's supported by neuroscience as well, that there's this kind of unnaturalness of memory, and that increasingly studies show that every time we recall a memory, we essentially reconstruct it and change it to some extent. So if we consider just memory itself as basically a construction, then in a sense, all memory could be considered artificial. So then the distinction between natural and artificial memory doesn't rely on the idea of some kind of authentic memory or authenticity alone. Instead, artificial memory kind of implies a procedural form of remembering, akin to protocols. And instead of viewing natural and artificial memory on a spectrum of authenticity, it's more useful to regard them as unprotocolized and protocolized approaches to memory. And it aims just beyond the recollection of innumerable images, like Agrippa mentioned. It also strives to enhance the organization of their retrieval through systematic encoding. And this is key to basically better order their recollection. But how did this kind of protocolization of memory start? So we're often told about the method of loci. This is a kind of common refrain repeated. It goes, the story of this Greek poet Simonides was reciting a poem at a banquet, stepped outside for a moment, and the banquet hall collapsed. And the remains of the guests were unidentifiable, and it was on Simonides to go in his memory, basically walk through place by place at the dinner table to remember who was sat where in order to identify the remains. And so this method, known as method of loci, and sometimes called the memory palace technique, basically involves how humans often relate memory to a kind of spatial territory or zone. So this became the kind of like bedrock of rhetorical approaches to memory from the time of Cicero, even to today. And we can find articles on like trusty WikiHow, even describing the method of loci and how to use it in our everyday lives. So this involves things like, for example, from the WikiHow article, essentially thinking of the 8 planets and placing them different places around our kitchen. It could be Jupiter goes in the fridge, Saturn goes in the sink, but essentially remember facts about the planets like Saturn's rings. And whenever you like traverse your kitchen or think about the planets while you do so, you can add more and more facts to these different places. And this actually works really well for human cognition as a form of a memory protocol. You can remember vast more amounts of information than you could if you might try to be just doing rote memorization. And this lineage of method of loci and this kind of protocolization of memory practices got its further evolution, and also method of loci is really not just restricted to Hellenic kind of Western specific world, but it's often narrated through that way in a lot of the books that I read. And in my larger project, I go over the more global practices broadly. But in this direct lineage from kind of rhetoric and Cicero to now, there's this concept of memory theaters, which emerged as the preferred formal structure for its practitioners. And the theater of Giulio Camillo best illustrates this practice. So it's pictured here. And it kind of remains more of a legend than fact, with only one small wooden model ever built, said to contain many images and rather disparagingly be full of little boxes. But despite its lack of realization, its attempts and its ambition could not be thwarted. The memory theater design featured ascending rows corresponding to the visible planets, and it aimed to locate and administer all human concepts, everything which exists in the whole world, as Camillo wrote. So this could include things like the natural sciences and the arts. And so while the suggestion that memory theaters administer knowledge of the whole world smells of hubris to some extent, their popularity signaled a new perspective in artificial memory and its protocolization. Memory theater models explicitly combine the notion of public space, a kind of image of the world or cosmos, and a knowledge system, in a way foreshadowing how we think about the internet and kind of early imaginaries of cyberspace today. And so from the method of loci to memory theaters, these very specific examples of artificial memory drew upon spatial metaphors, and they predated most of the computing metaphors that are prevalent today. But they played a really crucial role in shaping the concept of memory as something that could be encoded and retrieved through protocols, essentially laying the groundwork for the evolution from predominantly spatial metaphors to the prevailing understanding of memory as data. And so these practices, which really explicitly embrace the label of artificial memory, they might have been relegated to the rhetorical arts and kind of Cicero lineage if several thinkers had not applied them to the realm of deductive reasoning. So deductive reasoning involves a systematic approach to argumentation, deriving certain conclusions from provided premises. Its origins trace back much further, but in the 17th century, it gained a lot of significance when it began to be used as part of formal logic and mathematics. And for these thinkers, artificial memory took on an ordering function. So it signified like a methodical, structured, and procedural organization of concepts. And it rendered artificial memory conducive to deductive reasoning for this reason. And it was really crucial that the scope of artificial memory here was expanded beyond rhetorical arts to establish it as a component of deductive reasoning, because it would go on to influence artificial memory practices, would go on to influence the development of scientific method through Descartes, as well as thinkers like Leibniz, and acted within the broader landscape of knowledge systems like encyclopedias and the quest for a universal symbolic mathematical language. And all of these set the stage for an invention that would permanently reshape our perception of memory, which is the computer. And artificial memory as an idea and as an implementation essentially turned calculation machines into modern computers. For example, work such as Turing machines envisioned a machine capable of storing and reading states and executing actions based on its present state and input. And central to this conceptualization, he introduced the idea of a memory of infinite capacity, represented by a recording tape where symbols could be read, written, and erased. And as computing progressed, retrieving specific bits of information from computer memory usually required moving parts in the device itself to find the precise location where it stored the information that someone needed. So we have infinite memory, but we don't necessarily have infinite accessibility. It was the introduction of random access memory in 1947 that really changed this process. Because what value would there be in having all human concepts, to quote Camillo's memory theater ambitions, meticulously organized if you had to navigate them item by item to locate the desired information? So with this, we essentially had machine searchable memory, because RAM allowed data to be written and read in any order. And while engineers initially used other substrates like magnetic core grids for RAM, semiconductor memory made it a global reality and remains in use for most variations of RAM today. So with this new capability to read and write data in any order, it greatly impacted the utility of artificial memory. Because while all technology functions as memory supports through storage, machines were now capable of going one louder. this means actually performing the aim of artificial memory to not only store, but to better order recollection. But I also find questions of memory focus too much on the storage format. So rather than asking what medium stores artificial memory, to go for a different conceptual lens, we could ask instead how it operates in the world. And as part of the essay, I sketch a framework for understanding this operation. So we can differentiate between memory stored within an archive and memory that involves engagement, exploration, and retrieval from that archive. These two types can be described as latent memory and living memory. So latent memory, as I describe it, refers to the experiences that have the potential to be recalled and shared. And on the other hand, living memory refers to experiences in the process of being recalled and shared. And living memory itself is a fairly colloquial phrase. So whereas latent memory can be accessed, it's living memory that is actively transmitted. And we can observe an illustrative tension here between latent memory and living memory in approaches to preserving societal knowledge. So there's things like well-funded institutional endeavors to digitize knowledge. So a lot of cultural institutions, a lot of natural history museums basically have large budgets now to make digital versions of their archives. And these things called kind of memory databases that I refer to as in the essay, they do share a similar goal with the memory theaters of the past, inspiring to, quote, locate and administer a knowledge system. However, though, Camilla's memory theater involved feedback between a private memorization technique and a public theater, whereas memory databases often present themselves for kind of public consumption with very limited feedback mechanisms, and they inherit often outdated forms, or what you could call outdated forms, and many other things of organization. The latent memory they store can be accessed and shared, but they often lack kind of cultural practices necessary to encourage their transmission as living memory. And for this reason, it's kind of conceivable that we might find ourselves in a world where societal knowledge stored within archives, essentially what I'm referring to as latent memory here, slowly fades into obscurity and is partially forgotten. And kind of deriving directly from the memory as data metaphor, this could arise from our tendency to view memory as something that needs storage rather than transmission in order to endure. And there are definitely different types of latent memory apart from memory databases. And you can find some in the work of Lynn Kelly. She wrote the memory code, and she studies cross-cultural memorization techniques. She originally set out to explore animal behavior and Australian Aboriginal stories, but her research changed course after she discussed with elders and their knowledge revealed knowledge of animal behavior that far exceeded the insights of any field guide she'd encountered. And in her work, she shared stories about songlines, which can be described as short sung verses that correspond to features in a landscape, such as mountains, springs, and outcrops, visited in a fixed order along a path. And while this process could pass down similar knowledge as stored in memory databases, this artificial memory operates somewhat differently in the world. And its songlines and other practices, such as remembering stories related to constellations, make latent memory in the landscape living through a process of transmission and renewal. So in this context, the landscape or the night sky doesn't represent societal knowledge so much as it produces living memory through a relationship with its inhabitants. This stands in stark contrast to the memory as data metaphor, which tends to imply that knowledge exists relatively self-contained within its storage format. Whereas in songlines, the artificial memory lives relationally between mediums, so between landscapes and their inhabitants, rather than within a medium like discrete data alone. And so while we can also differentiate between latent memory and living memory, we could also add another axis here to distinguish between ordering principles in memory. So not only how they're transmitted, but how they're arranged. So in the essay, I go into the idea of associative arrangement and taxonomic arrangement of memory as well. And I show you about come together at the end. So among the examples explored so far, Some adopt a taxonomic approach. So these are things like encyclopedias and memory databases. And while we might be familiar with them, taxonomic knowledge systems operate on the premise of clearly defined and standardized relationships among the entities they encompass. This is evident in scientific classifications that organize organisms into distinct genus and species. And these taxonomic knowledge systems serve not only as a means of classification, but also as a method of human readable organization. And today we place less emphasis on this type of rote memorization, at least as adults, because we kind of search for things rather than remember them. Our phones surface our memories for us, and the proliferation of latent memory in the digital realm has really changed our relationship with living memory and replaces what might have been more of an internal process, like remembering a memory palace. And how this memory actually operates associatively in the world begins to look much more like the practices of songlines and less like kind of taxonomic entries in a memory database. So by contrast, we can see ideas and instances of associative arrangement in other practices, and even including the domain of shipping warehouses today. So traditionally, shipping warehouses organized items of the same category together, so putting different types of toothpaste together. But a new method called chaotic storage involves placing items wherever there's available space without adhering to a strict categorization. This method arose from the insight that having toothpaste distributed throughout the warehouse would increase the likelihood that a staff member might be near a toothbrush at the moment, or toothpaste at the moment an order came in for one, and therefore would be able to initiate the process sooner. So a combination of speed capital and greater logistics efficiency, supposedly. And the new technology like this reinforces our tendency towards an associative view of the world over a taxonomic one, even though the underlying ordering principles of this technology are, for now, inherited from human perspectives. But this isn't entirely new. Certain practices of artificial memory display associative over taxonomic arrangement. In the Luba Empire, court historians known as Bana Balute, men of memory, would be aided by a Lukasa memory board, shown here. And while they were reciting epics, genealogies, migration routes, they would run their fingers over the Lukasa's unique features. Clusters of lines on the board would often denote migration routes, and a red bead commonly portrayed an anti-hero, a rainbow serpent, from well-known Luba epics. So unlike more figurative representations, Lukasa boards are rooted in associative arrangement. The red bead doesn't necessarily try to represent the rainbow serpent, but in a sense, instead, the red bead becomes the rainbow serpent through association. This is not unlike how songlines produce memory with the landscape and its inhabitants. And here, this kind of concept of associative arrangement suggests connections between previously non-contiguous, so not next to each other, and asynchronous, so not at the same time, pieces of information, which might be placed together not due to human readable categories, but for example, in chaotic storage, because they belong to the same category in time. So in contrast to taxonomic arrangement, associative arrangement could be understood as the respatialization of memory, or the kind of remapping of memory to space, but according to different logic. To say in another way, through the ordering principles of associative arrangement, the map does not even pretend to be the territory. Instead, it creates a new territory through the power of association alone, something more kind of inhuman and associative. And to have this framework, just to say, like, more often than not, these categories are not mutually exclusive, and they often depend on the perspective where someone stands. So artificial memory blends taxonomic and associative arrangement, with individuals typically experiencing only certain aspects of each. So for example, a taxonomic memory database informs associations for a researcher. A landscape, like the latent memory within songlines, transmits its own living memory. These distinctions of which represents each or which is experiences each depends on your perspective and location within an artificial memory protocol. So it's a kind of operative protocol phenomenology more than it is a static guiding framework. What the framework does try to offer is a deepened sensibility around how memory operates and create some, while simultaneously trying to create some distance between ourselves and the increasingly ubiquitous memory as data metaphor. So this sensibility is not about searching for kind of better forms of artificial memory, but only how they function in the world. And these examples too, of course, from shipping warehouses to La Casa boards and from song lines to search engines, they share odd resemblances and they also share obvious differences. And they don't suggest any obvious value judgments between them. So instead, in kind of trying to define this sensibility, it's about how appreciating how artificial memory protocols embrace associative arrangement and offer insights for something called, and which I define in the piece, orientation. So it's a nascent sensibility that I tried to find. Orientation can be understood as a form of situational awareness that arranges knowledge in a selective and associative manner aligned with a particular purpose. Orientation enables navigation based on partial cues, feelings, and hints within an environment without presuming complete situational awareness. So there's a certain opacity at play. And this environment might be categorized by spatial non-contiguity and temporal asynchrony in relation to the participant. And the associations themselves can also be non-contiguous and asynchronous. Put another way, these associations do not need pre-established relationships as though unveiled through scientific classification. Instead, orientation generates connections between the elements it associates. So we can find a glimpse of this kind of abstract idea more concretely in the work of Aby Warburg, who was an art historian from the early 20th century. And one of his largest works, called the Builder Atlas, which was named after the Greek goddess of memory and mother to the muses, comprises 61 panels that feature nearly 1,000 images in total. And they range from images from antiquity to 20th century culture. And each panel assembles images around a certain thematic focus. So the thematic focus of coordinates of memory. Another one is archaeological models. And Warburg here establishes connections between the images, basically based on unconventional symbolic resemblances, a kind of idiosyncratic approach. And in his introductory writings for the Builder Atlas and elsewhere, he emphasizes the practice of Orientierung, orientation, through another concept he came up with called pathos formula. Not to go too deeply into it, but it basically describes recurring emotionally charged visual tropes in art. So it's a kind of idiosyncratic, symbolic language that, unlike attempts for universal languages, acknowledge their idiosyncrasy. And this concept of orientation that I'm trying to build here, as much as it surfaces kind of retrospective associations, so things like Warburg looking at art history and finding like different threads throughout, orientation also tries to surface perspective ones. So it looks back in time as much as it also shapes the future. And this is particularly the case through the endeavors of one artificial memory practitioner, Giordano Bruno, who holds really great significance in this context. So he was a defrocked monk, and his heretical ideas included considering the universe infinite and the earth not at the center of it. And much of his work basically dealt in memory. Bruno basically used things called memory wheels, which are illustrative diagrams with kind of movable concentric circles, originally devised by a scholar in the 13th century, named Loci. That's another rabbit hole. But memory wheels can be used to detail concepts related to a broader philosophical, religious, or moral framework. And through turning the concentric wheels, different concepts that are written on them can be combined to produce different thoughts for contemplation. So one book on Bruno's work by Francis Yates called The Art of Memory It details the art of memory more broadly, but you can tell that Yates really loves Bruno the most of everyone she talks about. And she also has several other books on him. But she wanted to basically look at Bruno's books and see the list of different memory images he gives. So he often says things like different types of animals or different planetary attributes, and gives these like long lists of 30 items and pairs them together. And she wanted to combine these lists with the practice of memory wheels, which Bruno did throughout his other works. So she takes the liberty essentially of arranging memory images from one of Bruno's books called On the Shadows of Ideas on a memory wheel, because he'd done this in a precedented way in many other aspects and iterations of his work. So in this memory wheel, which is shown here, it's too small to read, but she does things like she places astronomical images or words on the innermost circles with human images on the outermost one. So for example, there's certain ideas of like Saturnian attributes from myths, so kind of slowness, the Grim Reaper, etc., is placed next to Ceres, the inventor of yoke for oxen. And basically through placing these different images or symbolic forms or words next to each other, you essentially associate human and planetary narratives. So there's a juxtaposition of different ideas that, when associated with each other, produce a new form of memory and produce a new form of telling. And you see this taken kind of even further and even more abstract in Bruno's own work. So in some instances, Bruno expanded upon these memory wheels, so they weren't in such a kind of clearly segmented fashion with different explicit images paired next to each other in writing. Instead, there are these kind of abstract diagrams for memory places and memory images shown on this slide. So this memorization technique involving these images involved internalizing the diagram, so the diagrams here, and associating various concepts with different segments of the diagram, and essentially recognizing connections between these concepts. So it could be similarly different themes of relating humans to the cosmos. But here in this specific abstract artificial memory protocol, we see how it kind of totally breaks a semantic linkage between its medium or representation and its content, but in a way fully fuses them into one, because there's no longer the represented and the representation. And I would say that Bruno allowed himself this freedom because he asserted that universal procedures for a particular experiential recollection, what you could call artificial memory protocols, are essentially procedures not only to improve memory, but they're procedures kind of to reshape consciousness or create new associations. His diagrams didn't just signify a connection between humankind and the cosmos, they intended to produce it through contemplation. So what it appears really to us today as like abstract esotericism in Bruno's work, I think actually closely resembles the maxim of like McLuhan saying the medium is the message. So on one hand, Bruno's approach to orientation resembles hopeful delusions, suggesting that belief begets truth, that humans and cosmos are related in particular ways. But on the other hand, it signifies a kind of recognition of agency. Because despite the often involuntary nature of memory, intentionally cultivating memory through orientation can reshape consciousness, he posits at least. Because after all, even our thoughts about the future are themselves memories. So to conclude, it might be that here in the kind of abstract diagrams of Bruno and the definition of orientation given, that we might have finally reached like Agrippa's true cause for concern about artificial memory. So unlike natural memory, artificial memory protocols involve the invention of new devices like Lucasa boards, Imagine theaters, and these memory wheels. And these devices sever knowledge from their original context, and they kind of remold it into a different form. So no longer do we see these kind of taxonomic, human-readable relationships between information and how it's organized. Instead, we get machine-searchable memory associations, which create association through any kind of category we want to lump them into or produce through. And so Agrippa may have been cautious about this because of the essentially psychological risks posed by such total recontextualization and transformation. But we live in an age which foists these innumerable images upon us. We don't have to go seek them out like Agrippa was worried about. So we're constantly seeing images without context and even without any actionable, like originary ground truth, as we previously conceived ground truth to be possible. So we don't usually have a choice now to preserve the context of our encounters. Our encounters meet us more than we search for them. So considering the central role of living memory in shaping our consciousness and understanding of the world, we intentionally kind of cultivating memory practices and artificial memory may be worth the risks. And it may be worth acknowledging that it's now on us not to interpret context, but to reconstruct it as best we can. So, and kind of rather than fantasizing about a return to a pre-digital era of memory, we often have misconceived notions of the past being better, of kind of oral transmission being perfect. Instead here with like defining the sensibility of orientation, what I'm trying to do is elevate a through line of associative arrangement in the history of artificial memory. So this active process of orientation allows us to essentially trace a path through kind of forms of latent memory available to us towards the transmission of living memory. So it's kind of akin to leaving a trail of string behind, enabling us to remember our steps across various thresholds and reconstruct context. And in our everyday lives, one response to these changes in artificial memory, like prompt generated video, could be to actually embrace orientation as a practice and more consciously construct associative living memory in collaboration with machines, much as we've done for a long time with landscapes, which I think we're already doing, but the key word here is more consciously embracing this. And because this would ultimately involve reshaping our senses in light of these technological changes and abandoning the longstanding taxonomic distinction between the artificial and the natural. And so that's kind of a summary of a lot of the research that I came to by end of August last year, inventing terms, coming up with this framework, etc. But at the end of the research program, I was left with a lot of questions. So one of the main questions was, well, the answer seems obvious. It's why should humans care about remembering it all? Is it a type of unconscious and impersonal historical force, memory itself, or is it something deeply personal and embedded? So basically, is it necessary for living memory to be transmitted between living beings in order to endure? Does living memory require what we might recognize as consciousness, or could living memory exist between mediums and between agents? And if we abandon the long-standing distinction between the natural and the artificial, where are we left? So since the summer's research, I've basically been working on a book through these questions and looking medium by medium from like stone to silicon of how we can consider memory as a kind of force between different agents and actors and where memory actually resides. And I look at this through the case of specific technologies like zero knowledge proofs, through large language models, and even things like climate simulations and world models, and say, where does memory reside in these if it doesn't reside in kind of living memory transmitted by living beings? So it's kind of a mouthful. A lot of that was very close to the essay, as I wanted to give it its own context and clarity, hopefully. But yeah, went much more by the text than I normally would in a talk. If you want to follow the progress of the book, you can subscribe at my Substack. And it's a little bit early, but I'm happy to open it up for any questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kia. Open for questions and comments for Kia. If you're watching on the YouTube live stream, feel free to add a comment and I will make sure your question gets asked. Dorian, you want to start? Or actually, let's start with Venkat because I think he has to leave early. So.
Yeah, sorry if there's background noise. I'm out on a balcony with some wind, but can you speak a little bit to forgetting as the sort of like antithesis of remembering? Like, how do you sort of like restate your thesis in terms of like forgetting?
Yeah, so I think forgetting is really interesting because there's a kind of assumption you see in a lot of artificial memory protocols that forgetting is essentially the default. But then you see a lot of protocols actually developed for forgetting. And there's things like in the creating of a memory palace, you do this visualization where you actually remember burning a wing of the palace, right? And where everything that you stored in the wing of that palace is suddenly burnt down and gone. But from my perspective, after having done all this research and tried a lot of these practices, I actually don't think that that works. I think that forgetting is actually about lack of salience. And to consciously decide to forget something gives it a key moment of salience, because there's all these studies essentially where you remember something better if you take a cold shower after, or like in the Middle Ages, they would throw children in rivers after giving them a school lesson, and they would show that they remembered better. So I think there's actually a kind of natural entropy of forgetting. And there is that approach of like, forgetting actually involves never having spoken something, never having transmitted something. And it's basically taboo to some extent. An unreified taboo is the closest form of forgetting we get. Because I'm always amazed, when we go to archaeological sites that were built, anything over like 1,000 to 2,000 years ago, and there's actually very little narrative of what actually happened at those sites that is correct. So to me, there's a thing where when we construct what we want to remember, there's always an implicit line at which there's things that we want to forget on the other side of that. And the problem is we can't vocalize that forgetting very often, or it's not forgotten, it becomes more powerful. So I think there's a really important interplay there that basically salience is the guiding form of memory, and utility or decision to forget is not.
I'll add one comment that occurred to me as you were speaking, which is, it seems that human memory raises a paradox of salience, which is the very act of like consciously and deliberately trying to forget something actually anchors it in memory because it becomes a significant event. But when you move to technology, things like the EU's right to forget legislation, or like more technical means of forgetting and erasing records and like sealing records in courts, those seem like they break the paradox to some extent, because technologies can actually forget in ways humans paradoxically cannot.
Yeah, this is where I've come to a point in my research where I think that the equation of kind of human and societal memory with the equation of archival technological memory, that these should actually be entirely different terms. One of them should not be called memory because how they operate are entirely different.
Awesome. Dorian.
Hi. Uh, yeah, I was looking at the 2x2, or the sort of orientation that you gave, reminded me of something that I saw earlier, or at least the two axes. So one of them, the sort of what was it, the living memory versus the, what was it?
Latent
memory. And then the other two, so the it looked like sort of declarative versus procedural almost. Insofar as the living memory would be procedural and the latent memory would be declarative. And then the other axis looked a lot like extension versus intention with an S. And I wonder the extent to which you've encountered those concepts and the extent to which they kind of overlap, or if they're the same, or if they're not the same, so sort of, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think procedural and declarative don't necessarily one-to-one map. I could see how that they map in the sense that there's a kind of declarative nature to how latent memory is organized. But I think in terms of like both of them as kind of, I guess one categorization is they're kind of different approaches to encoding. Whereas I would view in like what I'm trying to find as latent and living memory as essentially differences in retrieval,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
Okay. So rather than the actual representation of it, it's the retrieval of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess I could see that because it's sort of like almost always is a procedure on your part, right? Whether or not the artifact itself is a declarative or procedural artifact, that like the way you are always doing it is always procedural. I could definitely see. There was the associative versus taxonomic though. The seems to map onto stuff that I've done in the past around extension versus intention, and whereas extension is like all of the elements of a given set, and then intention is the semantic relations between the two, and they're isomorphic to each other. And the difference wise is that you can explain, or there's basically way more intention than extension. The caveat is it doesn't have a neat and tidy structure like a taxonomy, and I think that looks very congruent to sort of my understanding of the situation.
Yeah, that sounds very, very similar. I would love if you could share more on both of those concepts and your work in relation to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll throw it in the Telegram or the forum or something.
Cool, thanks.
Chanel, you have a question.
First of all, this was a fascinating talk. And I am curious in your discussions about the history of computer memory retrieval and storage. How would that relate to sort of contemporary concerns that you hear about in online discourse about how upcoming generations of people who are introduced to computing via tablets and smartphones rather than traditional computers, how there's concerns that they may have, in some cases, less awareness of desktop file systems and sort of previous ways of storing computer files. Will that situation change how we relate to our awareness and how we remember digital files?
Yeah, I think totally. And there's interesting kind of different threads there, because how I was writing a lot about computing and computing memory, like I was thinking a lot about the kind of actual medium storage format, even though I say not to think about that, and kind of changes in our ability to access information. But also, like, there is that mental model produced that I think is a lot about what you're saying that will change. And I think it's actually true. I was talking about this the other day, that we may be produced in human civilization about 2 generations that actually understand how computers work. And now we might actually be going towards a generation that does not know. Because as we see, like basically already low-level compiling is taken care of, but of course, just even coding will increasingly be done with like more and more mediated UX. And also in the case like the model of the tablet, right? The mental model of how computing actually works is so far from how you experience the UX of a tablet or otherwise. So I think there's another layer of that's not just like the medium storage format discussion, but actually like memory is like having an adequate mental model of the environment that you're interacting with, and that this itself is kind of disappearing the more that we get associative arrangement. So there is also some need to have like a kind of taxonomic retracing of like understanding how machine bytecode actually runs a machine. And so yeah, like, but I do have the sense that there's a like active process of forgetting of how to construct the devices that allow us to remember better. And like, where will that be in 5 more generations? I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments for Kia? All right. Well, I think we might be able to wrap it up a little early today. Thanks so much for your talk, Kia. And the forthcoming book is exciting. And yeah, we will wrap it up and look forward to your research essay coming out very soon.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you.
All right. We'll see you all next week for Talk with Steve Healy. All right, thanks everybody.